Hello, I'm Sarah, the Windy City Baker, and this is the fifth and final chapter in our pound cake series. Today, I'm going to take all of the information that we've learned over the past 4 videos and use it to develop my own pound cake recipe. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, check out the links in the description below. In the meantime, join me as we journey down the baking rabbit hole. Before we start baking, let's go through what a pound cake is and what it should look like. A pound cake is a very basic butter cake that's traditionally made with a pound of each ingredient. So that's a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of eggs, and a pound of flour. Over the years, there have been a ton of different recipe variations, but most stick fairly close to this proportion of ingredients. In the present day, pound cake is usually served with a dusting of powdered sugar, a light glazing, or even with a coating of icing. This cake is great on its own, or you could add some fresh fruit and maybe even some whipped cream or ice cream. That's my favorite. It's typically made in a loaf or a bundt pan, and it's generally very simply decorated. When pound cakes are baked in a loaf pan, it's normal for the top of the loaf to crack slightly down the middle. The crack happens because the cake batter has a large amount of butter and is very dense. Now, as the cake bakes, the exterior of the cake cooks first and creates a crust. As batter continues to cook and rise during that baking process, the cake batter expands upward, which then results in the crack. Now, if you're a person who really doesn't want to see a crack, bake your pound cakes in a bundt pan. The hole in the middle of the pan helps to more evenly heat that batter, so you'll be more likely to end up with an even surface. But if you do end up with a crack when you're baking with a bundt pan, it doesn't matter because you're going to flip that cake upside down to serve it. So the crack would be on the bottom and no one would even know that it was there. There are also a few main components to look for when eating a pound cake. First, the loaf should have a slightly rounded top that frequently has a crack running down the middle, like we just talked about. The outside should have a beautiful golden brown color that's even across the entire cake. And when you take a bite of it, the cake should have this tender and moist crumb and a rich and buttery flavor. If there's a topping, it should be evenly spread without going too crazy on how much you add to it. Now, as I go through recipe testing, I'm going to keep all of these components in my mind so I can make sure that my recipe is perfect. So let's jump into recipe development. Before I even start baking, I spend time looking at a bunch of different cookbooks and recipes to get some inspiration for what to make. I also think about what I've eaten in the past and liked. Now, there are a few flavors that I know right off the bat I want to incorporate in this cake. First, citrus flavors work really well in pound cake. Now, I've already made a lemon pound cake on my website, which you can find a link for in the description box below. So I wanted to try something just a little bit different with this one while still sticking with citrus. So I decided on orange for the main flavor. Second, I love pound cake that's made with cream cheese. I think the flavor is fantastic, and we saw how it held up against other ingredient substitutions in our previous video, so I really wanted to incorporate that into this recipe. Third, I want to try to make something that hasn't been made a million times before, so I thought about different flavors that pair really well with orange. Now, growing up, every Christmas, my dad would buy the chocolate candy orange that you would bang on the counter to separate all of the orange segments. I thought this flavor combination would be really delicious in a cake, and it also isn't a flavor combo that I've seen all over the internet for pound cake. So today, we're going to be making an orange and chocolate chip pound cake. After thinking about the flavors, now it's time to think about baking science and how to make the recipe. So let's start with basic baking ratios. We already know that this recipe is basically identical weights of the 4 main ingredients. However, we learned in a previous video that only using those 4 basic ingredients leaves a little bit to be desired. So I need to make sure the batter has a little more air in it. To do this, I'm going to use the creaming method, which I'll talk about more in just a second, and I'll also try to incorporate a chemical leavening agent as well. Now, for the flavors, I know I need to replace some of my butter with cream cheese, add orange flavor, probably with orange zest, some chocolate, and salt, since I always bake with unsalted butter. Let's start with measuring your ingredients. I always suggest weighing your ingredients rather than using volume measures. Now, baking's a science, and it benefits from precision and consistency. Unfortunately, when you use volume measurements, like measuring cups or measuring spoons instead of weight, you can end up with wildly different amounts of ingredients. So do yourself a favor and get a digital scale to weigh out all of your ingredients. Now, one more important note about the ingredients that we're going to use is to make sure that they're at room temperature. This will allow everything to combine more easily when making the cake batter. It really does make a difference. Take my word for it. At this point, all of our ingredients are ready, so now we can finally make the cake. Start by adding your dry ingredients, or the flour, baking powder, and salt, to a medium bowl and whisk everything together to make sure it's evenly distributed. At this point, I'm also going to prepare my bundt pan. Now, you can use butter and flour, but I'm gonna use a baking spray with flour in it, and this is just to make sure the cake doesn't stick after it's done baking. Then use an electric mixer to cream the butter and sugar together. When using the creaming method, the fat and sugar are beaten together until the mixture is light and fluffy and has increased in volume. During this step, the rough surfaces of the sugar crystals cut through the butter and create these really small air bubbles that are encased in fat. These air bubbles lighten the mixture and help to naturally leaven that baked good, which essentially means that the air bubbles help the batter or dough rise while baking. Creaming usually results in light and fluffy textures, which is why it's frequently used for cakes and cookies. This method, when paired with the use of an electric mixer, should help incorporate more air into the pound cake batter instead of the brute force I used when making the 1747 version. Next, add the eggs in one at a time and beat until each is just incorporated. This technique will make it easier to disperse the liquid from the eggs, and you won't end up with your batter curdling. Add the dry ingredients in 3 additions so you don't get flour all over your kitchen. Finish by adding in the orange zest and chocolate chips. I chose to use semi-sweet chocolate chips so the cake wouldn't be too sweet. I also went with mini chocolate chips so there would be smaller pockets of chocolate in each bite. Next, pour the cake into the prepared baking pan and put it in a 350° Fahrenheit or 180° Celsius oven. Now, I'm putting the pan on a baking sheet just in case there's too much batter and it overflows. It is so much easier to clean a baking sheet than it is to clean the oven. This size cake will typically take around 35 minutes to bake in a 350° oven, so I'm gonna set a timer for 30 minutes. That way I can check on it and make sure it doesn't overbake. The cake is finished. I'm gonna let it cool in the pan for about 5 minutes before turning it out and letting it cool completely to room temperature. Here is our finished orange and chocolate chip pound cake, at least the first test recipe of it. You can see from the outside that there is beautiful, even golden brown color across the entire thing. And this is actually the first time that I've used this pan. So I'm really happy to see that there wasn't any sticking, even though there's a fair number of details that were in the pan as well, with all of these kind of crevices. And as you can kind of see in the top, right, it all goes into the center and is braided. So this is a really beautiful pound cake, and I'm super happy with the color on the outside. The color on this cake is very similar to the cream cheese cake in our previous video, where we were talking about the different ingredient substitutions that you could make to get sort of a moist cake and increase the flavor. So this looks pretty much identical to the result that we saw before. So that cream cheese is really consistent. So let's get into this and taste a slice so we can see what it's like on the inside. It's got a really nice, let me put this here, it's got a really nice crust along the edge. You can see the beautiful colors. I can smell, it smells exactly like that candy, the orange with chocolate candy. It smells phenomenal. Ooh, it tastes really good too. Wow, that is really, really good. The cake is super moist. The chocolate, I'm glad that I went with the mini chocolate chips because it's the perfect little burst of chocolate with the orange flavor that sort of is across the entire bite. And then when you're tasting it, you're not getting like citrus and then a pop of chocolate. It's kind of both at the same time. And I think that if I had used larger chocolate chips, you would have had the opposite. You would have had citrus, and then when you got a large chocolate chip in your bite, then you would have gotten that taste of chocolate instead of having the smaller pieces throughout. This is fantastic, and you can see as I'm kind of touching it how tender the cake actually is. It has small little air bubbles that are consistent in size throughout the entire slice. Even though it was our very first recipe that we tested, because we took all of the information that we learned from those previous videos, used baking ratios, and our best baking kind of science knowledge, we were able to knock it out of the park on the first try, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm gonna leave a link for the recipe in the description below so that you can make this at home, because I'm telling you, you are absolutely gonna wanna make this. I'm really loving this orange and chocolate chip pound cake, but let me know in the comments what your favorite pound cake flavor is. Also, if you missed any of the other pound cake videos in the series, click the links in the description box so you can learn all about pound cake's history, see me make the original recipe from 1747, determine the best store-bought pound cake, and compare ingredient substitutions for the best flavor and texture. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to see future videos. We have lots more planned that you won't want to miss. Thanks so much for joining me as we journeyed down the baking rabbit hole to learn all about pound cake. Until next time, I'm wishing you the best bake.